Hello, everybody, and welcome to our Adult Sabbath School lesson. We're studying Lesson 8 today, Free Will, Love, and Divine Providence. And speaking of providence, I've got a couple questions about what that word means and how that relates to God. But first, let me introduce who we're all here with. Pastor Sasha, Arena, and myself, Monique. So I'm going to read a little bit about the human definition of providence. I had to look it up on the dictionary because those things don't just pop in your mind. And I found that it's divine guidance or care, the power to sustain human destiny. And it is a different suffix ending of the word provident, making provision for the future. So when I read the definition, I think of a lot of God's traits, his character and stuff like that. And I think of a specific person, Solomon. So would you say that Solomon was God's choice? Or would you say that Solomon was the choice of the people before him and God had to kind of just make do and work with what he had?
Well, this is a very important question. And let's take a look at the Bible. In this story, Nathan, the prophet, comes to David, and David has the desire to build a temple. So let's just read it. 2 Chronicles chapter 17, verses 1 and 2.
After David was settled in his palace, he said to Nathan the prophet, "Here I am, living in a house of cedar, while the ark of the covenant of the Lord is under a tent." Nathan replied to David, "Whatever you have in mind, do it, for God is with you."
Okay, so the setting is, David has a nice palace made out of cedar wood, which doesn't exist in Israel. So they had to import it from Lebanon. So it's expensive house, basically. But the house of the Lord, which is the sanctuary, is still in the tent of Moses, it's tent. So noble desire, right?
Right.
He feels bad, he wants to do it, but as it says, Nathan at night saw the vision, and here is the vision. This is what God says. Let's read the same chapter, verses 4 through 14.
"Go and tell my servant David, this is what the Lord says. You are not the one to build me a house to dwell in. I have not dwelt in a house from the day I brought Israel up out of Egypt to this day. I have moved from one tent site to another, from one dwelling place to another. Wherever I have moved with all the Israelites, did I ever say to any of their leaders whom I commanded to shepherd my people, 'Why have you not built me a house of cedar?' Now then, tell my servant David, this is what the Lord Almighty says. I took you from the pasture from tending the flocks, and appointed you a ruler over my people Israel. I've been with you wherever you have gone, and I have cut off all your enemies from before you. Now I will make your name like the names of the greatest men on earth, and I will provide a place for my people Israel, and will plant them so that they can have a home of their own and no longer be disturbed."
Yeah, so this is the start. So God is choosing son of David to build the temple. So specifically, as David learns later, because at this point David doesn't know because he has many sons, but a little later, this is what happens. Chapter 22, 1 Chronicle 22, verses 6 through 10.
1 Chronicles 22, 6 through 10. Then he called for his son Solomon and charged him to build a house for the Lord, the God of Israel. David said to Solomon, "My son, I had it in my heart to build a house for the name of the Lord my God. But this word of the Lord came to me. You have shed much blood and have fought many wars. You are not to build a house for my name, because you have shed much blood on the earth in my sight. But you will have a son who will be a man of peace and rest, and I will give him rest from all his enemies on every side.
Yeah, so you can see, it's clear that God is over it to the point that even his name is given specifically. Solomon means Shlomo in Hebrew. It means his peace. So David, you had too many wars, you shed too many bloods, I can't let you build the temple. Your son will not be like you. And to be honest, just a side story, just a short one. Basically, people often, talk about the Bible, and they talk about God who is harsh and who is all these wars and blood and stuff like this. And it's not easy questions, because there's so many different stories. And some of the stories are not difficult to see where God is, but some of the stories are the most difficult. And the most difficult stories are with David.
True.
You read about, you read Joshua, you understand why the war happened and when the war doesn't happen. You read the book of Judges, there's lots of bloodshed there, but you see Israel apostatizes left and right. You read about David, and he kills. And he's a friend of God. This is difficult. This is difficult. But at the end of all of it, God says, no way you're going to build me a temple, because your hands are full of blood, to be honest.
Yeah, honestly, yeah.
So, but Solomon, even his name, peaceful man. Solomon hasn't killed anyone.
I love God's values. Like, sometimes it is hard to kind of decipher and stuff like that. And people can use the things that human beings do as a way to negate the Bible and say, like, oh, how can God allow this and that? Okay, first of all, these are the acts of people. This is a historical account. And the people that are doing those bad things, God holds them accountable. Because of what David did, he's like, don't touch my temple. That's not something for you to do. A peaceful man is going to build my temple. So it's very interesting to see God's values shine in a way like that.
Yes. So it was, God was in control of the history of Israel in a sense.
Right. Okay, so Solomon, well, let me step back a little bit. So David and Bathsheba, it wasn't necessarily like Abraham Hagar situation. It wasn't him like trying to make a son of his own, means. It just so happened that
it was worse.
Oh, okay.
It wasn't like Abraham and Sarah. Abraham and Hagar was bad. With David and Bathsheba, it was worse.
Yeah, but Solomon was still chosen by God despite.
Yeah, God has, Solomon. The fact how Solomon came into being has nothing to do with him.
Has nothing to do with Solomon, nothing to do with God.
No, with Solomon.
Okay,
He
right.
didn't
True.
choose to be born. It's his father's doing.
Right. Yeah.
You're right.
Exactly.
Thank you for saying that.
Perfect. I love. Okay, so then
Nice way to say it.
Solomon was chosen by God, but Saul was chosen by the people, or more so the people's interests, and God was like, I'm going to let him have it? Or how did that happen?
Oh, yeah. So it's a little different situation, but let's take a look. Let's just read 1 Samuel chapter 8 and read verses 4 and 5.
So all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah. They said to him, "You are old, and your sons do not follow your ways. Now appoint a king to lead us, such as all the other nations have."
So what's the problem there?
Ooh, I don't know.
Why? I mean, were people right by asking Samuel to do this?
I mean, I feel like it came out of their selfish reasons, considering the line literally goes, such as all the other nations.
Yeah.
They wanted a king like everyone else. I don't know if it's because they just want somebody to tell them what to do, or because Samuel wasn't enough for them anymore, being the prophet and letting them know God's will. But it appears to be more from their selfishness rather than actual God's will, to me, at least.
I could say the same.
Yes, that's the part of a problem. See, this is not a black and white situation here,
Yeah.
because you remember who was before Samuel,
Oh, yes. The
the
wicked
high
sons.
priest
Yeah,
with
yeah.
his two sons.
Eli. This is
Eli,
Eli.
right, right. Good for you. So, Eli, was he actually a bad or a good person?
I mean,
He
good or
wasn't
bad dad?
terrible.
Different question. But like, yeah, he wasn't terrible. As a priest, he did what he needed to do, and I think he didn't have the people's trust.
Father figure's a different story.
Yeah, father figure's a different. He wasn't a bad guy though.
He wasn't. He was a good guy.
Right.
His sons were bad guys.
Yeah.
They're wicked.
Yeah.
They were absolutely wicked. Sometimes God give us mercy over our children.
Yeah.
But sometimes we have good children, sometimes we don't. You know, I'll never forget a friend of my pastor whose two sons were absolutely wicked. And I remember he talking to me and he said, why God punishes me? Why am I having to put up with my two sons who are just wicked? And they were. There was another case, and I was a teacher at the seminary back in the 90s in Russia, and there was this young man, a wicked young man, a student there. And how could he study to be a pastor?
Oh, boy.
I mean,
I
he
would've
was
snitched.
just a wicked young man. And I met with some of the conference people, and I said, guys, what are you doing? Why have you sent this guy? He's wicked and he's not motivated to study. You know, we're having troubles. The guys, the administrators from that conference told me, we know the situation, but be merciful to his father. Later I learned that he had two older siblings. When they were young, they died because electric power line collapsed and they were killed by electric current. So he was the only one left. And this man, the pastor, whose son was this wicked student, they said, don't talk to him, don't, because he knows, and if you talk to him, he'll just cry. They respected this pastor very much. He was a very respectable man, and it was a very, very uneasy situation. You know, I came back to the seminary. He graduated anyway. But it was an interesting thing. Probably like 8 years passed, and I meet people and this family, and I discover that they're his in-laws, and they tell me his story about how he got married, how he changed, how he became a good pastor,
Praise God.
and how he died from cancer later, a year ago. So it was a tragic story, but the Lord has his ways, you know.
Yeah.
It's you know, previous lesson about the tragedies and evil in the world. So they were telling, yeah, he was absolutely ruthless while he was in a seminary, but he fell in love with our daughter, And when he fell in love with her, his heart changed. His heart turned to Jesus, and he turned his life around. So go figure.
Right.
You know, sometimes. So Eli himself, what the problem was, going back to Samuel, Eli himself was a decent high priest. At least, you know, he raised Samuel in a godly manner.
True. He knew what he was doing.
Yeah, you know, one-sided sometimes the image of, I know sometimes, you know, how Adventists see Eli. They see him because in book Patriarchs and Prophets, it's written that Eli was a bad father. He did not discipline his children, which might have been, and he was a bad father. But by the time when Samuel came, he apparently, what happened, especially, you know, God talked to Samuel. Eli explained to him how to talk to God, directed. Eli, you know, was very good to his mother who was crying. He thought first she was drunk, but then he realized no, and he prayed, you know. So it's like he had his fair share of mistakes maybe in the past. And now he's, by raising Samuel, he basically was trying to compensate for good, because eventually Hophni and Phinehas died. The Eli's lineage of high priests got cut off with the death of the sons and with the death of the daughter-in-law. So Samuel was able to take control of the situation and pull Israel out of misery.
Right.
So, but now what happens?
He's getting old, and his sons don't follow his ways, so they can't carry on his.
So what is people of Israel thinking?
Something?
They had Hophni and Phinehas, and they learned from a bad history. Now they respect Samuel very much. But they say, we respect you, but we don't trust your sons.
Is it that they didn't trust the sons, or is it that the sons just didn't end up becoming priests?
Well, they were taking bribes, they were judges, and they were corrupt.
They were, okay.
They were corrupt.
I didn't know that.
Nothing, and so it's basically Samuel didn't like it. But look to God's answer.
Yeah, because it looks like they're not really trusting God to fix it. So they want to do it their own might. So yeah, I'm curious how God's like, well, here's what you tell him, Samuel.
Yeah, and he says, you know, they rejected me.
Yeah.
And you're right, Monique. They rejected him by not trusting that he has a solution.
Yeah.
But take a look. Read verse 9.
Now listen to them, but warn them solemnly, and let them know that the king who will reign over them will claim as his rights.
Yeah. So listen to their voice. But God does not, God doesn't like the situation, but he does not oppose the situation, because we have in the book of Deuteronomy a special provision for that. Take a look at Deuteronomy 17, verses 14 through 20.
Deuteronomy 17:14 through 20. When you enter the land of the Lord your God is giving you, and have taken possession of it, and settle in it, and you say, let us set a king over us like all the nations around us. Be sure to appoint over you a king the Lord your God chooses. He must be from among your fellow Israelites. Do not place a foreigner over you, one who is not an Israelite. The king, moreover, must not acquire great numbers of horses for himself, or make the people return to Egypt to get more of them. For the Lord has told you, you are not to go back that way again. He must not take many wives, or his heart will be led astray. He must not accumulate large amount of silver and gold. When he takes the throne of his kingdom, he is to write for himself on a scroll a copy of his law, taken from that of the Levitical priests. It is to be with him, and he is to read it all the days of his life, so that he may learn to revere the Lord his God, and follow carefully all the words of his law and these decrees.
So there was a permission, if you say, we want a king, okay,
Here are the rules, or here are the terms.
you can get it, but here are the terms. And going back about Solomon, he didn't kill anybody, but the biggest problem started
With the wives.
even not with wives. Take a look at 1 Kings 4:26.
Solomon had 4,000 stalls for chariot horses and 12,000 horses.
So don't buy chariotry and cavalry and
If
hello.
you're trying to be a peaceful man.
Right, and God promised that he would subdue his enemies, so what is he?
You're right.
Need all those
Exactly.
for?
God promised. That's why he said Israel does not need to have standing army. Solomon had a standing army. This army never went to war. What was this army doing? Take your guess.
Wasting money?
Exactly. Sucking money out of the country.
Yeah. That's unfortunate. And so
Which during the Solomon's peak year, it was the wealthiest country, and everybody wanted to have business with it. And when he started spending all his money on what God said not to do, at the end, after his death, the country was bankrupt.
yeah. So it may have started at the women, but it definitely didn't end there. It's every choice that he continued to make after the fact.
Yes, spiritual and financial. At the middle of his life, it was a disaster. At the end of his life, he said, vanity, vanity, all vanity, and repented.
Right.
But for the country, it was too late.
Right. So then that actually kind of brings me to my next kind of question about that. So he eventually understood that everything he had done came to nothing. All his works, everything that he worked for, all his choices, yes, were in the end were vanity. So how does that play into free will then? Because my question then is, if everything that we choose is vain, then how is it not God's choice? Because everything that God does and God plans, is for our good, to give us a hope and a future, and everything that we do is vanity. So it's like, where does that play into free will, and how does that negate predestination?
Yeah. First of all, I would like to turn our attention to what actually God wants us to do. And so take a look at Deuteronomy 30, verse 19.
This day I call the heavens and the earth as witnesses against you, that I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Now choose life, so that you and your children may live.
You see? God does not predestine someone for curse and someone for blessing. He brings it. Okay, you choose this path, you're going to get curse. You choose this path, you're going to get blessing. But you choose. So there's a very specific statement here in Deuteronomy 30:19 that we choose which way to go. Solomon chose to marry these women. Solomon chose, God had all kinds of resources in Solomon's disposal, but Solomon chose to waste resources. It was his choice. So because, as we discussed in the previous lesson, something like love, you can't predestine anybody to love God. You can't predestine anyone to make choices. God is not interested in this. So with the next verse, choose life that you would live and love your God. So choose to love God. Verse 20. I just don't want to go into this verse right now. So there are two things about predestinations which we need to understand correctly. So there are two confusing verses in the book of Romans.
Right.
Let's just quickly take a look at this.
It's Paul kind of really gets at is kind of uncovering all the lies that people in these churches, like what they're accustomed to, what they're used to, what their culture says, what their society says. And like once they meet Christ, once they meet the gospel, once they meet the truth, they still have like these like lies in their mindset and in the ways that they live. And like Paul really works on
Paul
distinguishing the truth from the lies.
In Christian theology, it's a misunderstanding of what Paul means. Take a look at Romans 8, verses 28 through 30.
And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. For those God foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, that he might be the firstborn among many brothers and sisters. And those he predestined, he also called. Those who he called, he also justified. Those he justified, he also glorified.
See, many even theologians since the times of Reformation, famous John Calvin, he would take verse 30 out of context. Oh, he predestined, and God called those whom he predestined, and he justified only those who were, and conclusion is, he was predestined to justification. But if you take it in the beginning from verse 28, it's very clear. So it says, those who love God. You cannot predestine anyone for love.
Right.
So these people chose to love God, but how does God predestine them to be conformed into the image of his Son? Verse 29, because he had foreknowledge.
Okay. So predestination is not so much like talking about destiny, but just like God's discernment. God just knows.
God has foreknowledge, but God's foreknowledge does not influence whether or not the individual loves him.
Gotcha.
God just knows who loves him. That's all.
Right. So then what's part two of that?
Yeah. So that's what Calvin back in the 16th century and all his followers, and most of the Protestant theology today is Calvinistic, and it's based only on one verse out of three. And the key element is, those who love God. And we go back to Deuteronomy. Choose life so that you would love God. So you choose, you have life and death. You choose life, and by choosing life, you love God, and then God knows that you're going to choose it, and only then he predestines you. It's not like someone, it's kind of interesting. People debate with me, and they said, see, God predestined, one fellow from one of the Baptist churches, Russian Baptist churches, told me the story about how his mother back in USSR was pregnant with him, and his father, he even never met him, and she was going to have abortion, and on the bus she met a Christian woman who led her to Jesus, and she canceled her abortion. And it was interesting because I remember an interesting situation. Back in Cincinnati, Jacob was little, and we would bring him to pediatrician. And it was interesting. The pediatrician office was across the parking lot together, and then across the parking lot of pediatrician office was this, so I don't know, like women clinic, whatever. So every time we would come to pediatrician, we would see Christians picketing. Mm-hmm. And when I would take Jacob out of the car and carry him, this man would smile and wave, and he would have a poster, and the poster, addressing to women. And I was observing, the car would pull into the parking lot, and the woman would come out, and this woman would, this man would, and maybe more people would show try to offer literature, and she says no thank you and goes on her way. So I say to this Baptist man, you were predestined to be saved, and this baby was predestined to be aborted? Or was it the choice of a woman not to take heed to this appeals of this Christian picketers?
Yeah, it's kind of like putting God's name on mankind's sins. Doesn't make sense.
So, to make a long story short, Romans is a big book, and chapter 9 continues debating. God does not predestine individuals. He does not predestine you or me to love him or to be saved. We individually choose to love him. But when we look at Romans, God predestines nations. So the destiny of a country, a nation, can be inevitable.
Right. We dabbled a little bit in that, I remember. So that's like the second part then, because like there were two things you kind of wanted us to nail down as far as predestination. So the first being that God doesn't predestine people, and the second being that God predestines nations.
Yeah, God controls the history. Mm-hmm. God does not control our heart. Mm-hmm. God cannot coerce us or buy our love. He doesn't want it. He wants us to choose to love him, to choose life. But if God has a purpose in history, and there's like Daniel says to Nebuchadnezzar, after you will be another kingdom. You're not going to be here forever. Nebuchadnezzar resisted. He even built a golden statue. Didn't help.
Right.
His grandson, Belshazzar, drank the kingdom away to Persians. And off Babylon is gone. There's nothing could change it.
Right. So yeah, God has his hand in history. He has his hand on his nation and overall his people. But as far as individuals go, it's an individual choice and it's an individual journey. And that's all we have for lesson 8. We hope that you enjoyed this journey with us. Let's continue the conversation down in the comments, share the video, and let as many people in as we can to spread the word and spread this information. Hope you learned something, because I know I did. Thanks so much for your time. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, hit the bell notification so I see you next time. And until then, bye-bye.